Okay, so this is going to be a tricky thing for me to do. I'm used to running around in the classroom from side to side and going to the whiteboard and back and being all frenetic about that sort of thing. But um, I'm going to do my best to sit here in this seat, staring at this screen, and walk you through a lot of slides on this PowerPoint. And we'll see how I do, if I can stick it out and stay in one place. Particularly going to be difficult for me because this topic is one that's really, really important to me, one I'm really, really passionate about and would like to share. And it's a topic that overall I think far too few people know about or understand the history of, especially in psychology. But one that's important to take a look at because, as I've said from the beginning of this class, ideas have consequences. And this topic of eugenics is a very concrete place, I think, where we can see ideas having consequences, often truly horrible consequences. Anyway, so without more blather on that, then let's just jump into this, because there's a lot of slides to go through here, a lot of information to cover, because I want you to be able to leave this class fully informed and having a good, deep sense of what eugenics is, where it came from, what the ideas were that supported it, its impact in major ways in Western culture, in the world, really, and psychology's role, professional psychology's role, both traditionally, historically, and even get us thinking about the role it might play currently or in the near future. So anyway, this first slide here, which I hope you can all see. If this recording is working out right, then you can. But this is from a very old, turn of the century, not just last century, turning into the 20th century, from a textbook, kind of explaining in picture format what eugenics is and offering a definition. It is the self-direction of human evolution, right? Darwin offered up a worldview in which evolutionary adaptation and change and development was not guided in any way. It was random. It wasn't necessarily progressive in any particular direction. A lot of people think about evolution as progressively creating human beings at the top of the evolutionary scale. That's not the view that Darwin actually articulated. But defenders of eugenics, specifically Galton, who we'll talk about, took the idea that, well, now once we understand the processes of natural selection, adaptation, and so forth, we can, now that we understand that, we can take control of that for ourselves and direct our own evolution in more fit, more beneficial directions, right? But anyway, this image here, this picture of this eugenics tree is very interesting because it's pointing out where the roots are for eugenics, the disciplinary and ideological roots are. And as you can see, there's of course genetics, anthropology, ethology, statistics, genealogy. That's very important. Medicine, surgery, what have you. But you'll also notice if you look at this over in the left-hand corner, you'll see psychology, mental testing, anthropometry. That is an impossible word for me to say. So it's that other word down there with anthro at the front, anthropometry. Anyway, you see that. You'll see sociology over, and education and psychiatry over on the right-hand side. So when people do know a little bit about eugenics, they typically think of it in terms of evolutionary biology or genetics solely in that area. But I want to show you how psychology has had an important role to play intellectually, that the eugenics project was supported by psychologists, very important psychologists, and it's also relevant today. So this is the next slide here. You don't have to worry too much about this. I just wanted to share it. It's from, again, a very old journal article. Has an interesting typo there in the top. Written by Gladys Schlesinger. It's called The Role of Psychology in Eugenics. That was the title of the article. This is just the first page. She was apparently, I think that's supposed to be a consulting psychologist of the American Eugenics Society. And so she just starts out the article by pointing out that eugenics is this program of self-directed evolutionary progress, right? spell some of that out. Near the bottom of the left-hand column, last paragraph there, it says the sciences which contribute most extensively to the fund of eugenic wisdom are psychology, biology, sociology, anthropology, economics, and the new science of, in that day, in the early 1900s, demography, right? Demographics, the study of population trends. That was kind of a new thing. I think it's important that you see there that of the disciplines that she mentions, biology is included clearly, but all of the other disciplines that she lists are social science disciplines, not biological science disciplines. So that gives you some sense right off the bat that that eugenics is something that was very important in the social sciences. So we got to talk a little bit about Francis Galton. He's the chap who he coins the term eugenics. He articulates the first kind of defense of it and advocates very strongly a eugenics project. And so anyway, the term, as you can see from the slide here, the term means good birth or well-born. He coined it, he invented it. He had a different term early on. We'll see here in a second. He wasn't a real fan of that term because it didn't kind of roll off the tongue well, but eugenics did, and so he likes that one. But the as you should have understood from some of the readings, Francis Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin. He was very excited about Darwin's ideas when he read them, and he immediately jumped from seeing them as important in biology to having applicability in his mind, applicability to human behavior and the study and understanding of human behavior, human psychological phenomena. Darwin, of course, is arguing that through process of random undirected natural selection, our physical traits and species arise. And Galton takes that idea and says, well, that's going to hold true for psychological traits as well, for intelligence in particular, but many other sorts of personality characteristics. He, as I say there, so he argued that the traits like intelligence, like criminality, like just assertiveness, desire to achieve and succeed, and those sorts of things were ultimately governed by Darwin's natural selective argument for evolution, because psychological phenomena were ultimately, according to Galton, were biological phenomena themselves. They originated in, were governed by biology. So the presumption is that the laws that govern biological evolution have to govern psychological evolution as well. Galton's kind of famous, not just for eugenics, but famous for his work in statistics. He developed a multitude of interesting statistical forms of analysis. He contributed to the rise of the discipline of demography, and his basic philosophy was whenever you can, count. And that quickly morphed into, if you can't count it, then it doesn't exist. If you can't capture it in some quantitative, measurable way, then it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. He had this to say about kind of laying out why the eugenics project is so important. He says, I have no patience with the hypothesis occasionally expressed and often implied, especially in tales written to teach children to be good, that babies are born pretty much alike, and that the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and man are steady application and moral effort. It is in the most unqualified manner that I object to pretensions of natural equality. The experience of the nursery, the school, the university, and of professional careers are a chain of proofs to the contrary. I think that stern compulsion ought to be exerted to prevent the free propagation of the stock of those who are seriously afflicted by lunacy, feeble-mindedness, habitual criminality, and pauperism, which is persistent poverty, right? But that is quite different from compulsory marriage, right? How to restrain ill-omened marriages is a question by itself, whether it should be effected by seclusion or in other ways yet to be devised that are consistent with a humane and well-informed public opinion. I can, whatever that may be, he says, I cannot doubt that our democracy will ultimately refuse consent to that liberty of propagating children, which is now allowed to the undesirable classes. But the populace has yet to be taught the true state of these things. We get all this freedom, anybody can marry and have children, and as many children as they want. This is a problem for Galton. It's leading to all sorts of problems. It leads to the propagation, the increase of undesirable psychological and personality traits in the larger population. And so we have to convince people, we have to convince our culture that it's important to manage this for our own benefit. A democracy, he says, cannot endure unless it be composed of able citizens. Therefore, it must, in self-defense, withstand the free introduction of degenerate stock. the unintelligent, the mentally incapable, the physically deformed, those who have personality traits that are corrosive or problematic in society. He feels we have to take control. And now his cousin Charles has shown us how this works in the natural world in biological traits. Let's start doing it with psychological traits. We greatly want a brief word, he said, to express the science of improving stock. Excuse me, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which, especially in the case of men, takes cognizance of all influences that tend, in however remote a degree, to give to the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. Now, understand, because if we just leave it up to nature, well, then there's no certainty that the best traits in the psychological realm are going to necessarily win out. We may get overwhelmed by those who are less intelligent or more indolent, prone to perpetual poverty or loose morals. We may end up they may end up having more children, and end up then, because there are more of them being propagated, driving out those who have superior characteristics and abilities. So this is very important. We have to deal with this. And then he says, so the word eugenics, right, would sufficiently express that idea. The word, so he's coining this term, right? It is at least a neater word and more generalized one than viviculture, which he once ventured to use, but doesn't, like I said, doesn't really roll off the tongue. People don't quite understand what that means right away. Well, let's talk about eugenics specifically, because there are two kinds, two broad kinds of eugenics, right? There's positive eugenics, right? And this is the view that says humans should be bred to improve the species, right? That we should see that the most fit among us reproduce. So we have to find people who have the best characteristics, both physical, psychological, higher intelligence, what have you. Identify those people and get them to marry, get them to mate and raise children, because their children are more likely to be better, to be improved stock. So there were better baby contests that were fostered. The eugenics movement in various states fostered these kind of contests. We had fitter family contests, right, where substantial financial rewards were offered. It was quite competitive. What this slide shows a medal that was given for the winner of a better baby contest, right? It says, I have a goodly heritage, and that and the financial rewards were a big deal. One important thing, I forgot to mention it early on. Let me mention it now. When we do think about eugenics, when people do, we bring that up, and if they are familiar with the idea, they often tie it directly to Nazi Germany, right? Because the German, Hitler's German Empire, right, pursued a eugenics program very, very ruthlessly. They were looking for the perfect Nordic, Aryan race, and they did all sorts of things to try and weed out undesirables. Jews were considered undesirables, gypsies, homosexuals, a whole variety were forcibly attempted to be weeded out of the society. But also this more positive sort of eugenics was conducted by the Nazis as well. But it's important that you understand that eugenics doesn't start with the Nazis. In fact, Hitler and his followers, they adopt the eugenics project to rapidly pursue their racist ideology. They adopted it from the British and the Americans because we were well ahead of the curve. That Britain and the United States were really the breeding ground, no pun intended, for the eugenics project. It was very, very popular, and there were a lot of things we'll see as we go through this. A lot of things going on in Britain and the United States that Hitler and his cronies picked up on, and were actually kind of surprised that then the British and the Americans turned around and condemned them for their eugenics, because as Hitler and his followers would say, well, we're just doing what you've all been doing anyway. Right? So understand this is a British and American phenomenon before it becomes a Hitlerian and German kind of phenomenon. So positive eugenics, that's one, right? That's one approach. But there's also, well, let me show you some things first. Here's a state fair from 1920 in Kansas. Here was the eugenics building at the Kansas State Fair, and this couple with their little baby sitting in the middle. They won the contest. They won the Better Baby, Fitter Family contest. We have doctors and nurses and other professionals who were involved in this. We have some state officials over on the left-hand side. It was a big deal. You could get a eugenics certificate, right, which you get examined for your characteristics, your quality, and then you could share this. You had this to show to other people that you were fit. This eugenics certificate guaranteed that this doctor has examined the sender of the card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. Right? Anyway, but now let's talk about negative eugenics. So there's positive, which is trying to encourage the fit to breed, to mate, to raise families, so on and so forth, to increase the number of fit. Negative eugenics is the flip side of that. Negative eugenics is an attempt to get the less fit to not breed, right? To not have offspring, to not marry and produce less fit offspring. So there's discouragement here. This is the source of many of our anti-miscegenation laws. So what you have here on the slide is from 1932. So this is, just on the eve of World War II. It's the first, third of the 20th century. The point here is that we want the states who were committed, the groups that were committed to eugenics, and not everybody was committed, right? There were critics and there were struggles. It was important, but it was a powerful movement. But what they're moving towards is that we need to be very careful about who we let marry who. We don't want the unfit marrying each other. We don't want different races mixing, because the different races are more or less fit, more or less desirable, right? And of course, the white race was by and large considered to be the best race, and then you had to work your way through this anyway. So laws were passed to control. In fact, this is the origin. Everybody today, just you're going to get married. Well, we have to go down to this, the city building, and we have to get a license. We have to get a license. You used to have to do blood tests, things like that. This is where that started, right? The idea that government had a role to play in deciding who could marry who, and that licensure was necessary, and that, again, for a very long time, blood tests were required to determine, and some genealogy had to be provided on occasions in different states to make sure that the right people are marrying the right people, so that the right kind of children are born, and the wrong kind of children aren't born. There were compulsory sterilization laws, right? The states, many states had laws in place that indicated certain people could be sterilized without their consent, right? They could be forced to be sterilized. Habitual criminals, people in mental hospitals, situations like that. And we'll talk about a couple of instances of that and on a very famous case, Supreme Court case, as we go through here. But as I say, there were all sorts of marriage restrictions, and there were lots of immigration restrictions. This is also the late 1800s, early 1900s, is that period of time where the federal government in the United States kind of takes over immigration and begins to assert its authority to determine who gets to come in the country, who doesn't get to come in the country, how many people, how many percentages, so on and so forth, and establish that early on in our nation's history, individual states dealt with that, right? States that had borders with Canada in the north, Mexico in the south, or on the Atlantic Pacific Ocean, they decided for themselves. But increasingly, the federal government becomes concerned here about immigration, particularly Asian and Hispanic, Latino immigration, Eastern European immigration, Middle Eastern, that sort of thing. It was very important. So lots of some immigration restrictions are placed. The eugenics advocates were very, very fervent in arguing for birth control methods, making abortion legal and encouraging it, particularly among African Americans, right? The argument was that one way to kind of control that population, to keep it at a minimum, was to encourage abortion, so on and so forth. There were a lot of voices, right? Havelock Ellis, he was a British physician, a psychologist, and an ardent socialist in the early 20th century. He had this to say, and this is how negative eugenics is captured. He says, "The superficially sympathetic man flicks a coin to a beggar. The more deeply sympathetic man builds an almshouse for him, so he need no longer beg. The most radically sympathetic of all is the man who arranges that the beggar shall not be born." Now, when we talk about negative eugenics in particular, again, I think a lot of people, their mind goes directly to Nazi Germany and we think, oh, these evil monsters busy coming in and they're picking on certain kinds of people and eradicating them, forcing them into cattle cars and sending them to concentration camps, that sort of thing. And certainly that's true. That was what the Nazis were doing in World War II, pre-World War II era Germany. But that sort of thing is a hard sell. That sort of idea was a hard sell in the West, in Britain and America. And so what you find is the advocates of eugenics tend to be not rabid Nazi racists. They tend to be well-educated, kind folks who are making a humanistic appeal. Like Ellis here, the logic is fascinating, right? Sympathy is important, but there are different levels of sympathy. And the most superficial sympathy is just giving the beggar some money. A little better maybe would to build him an almshouse, right? A place to live, a powerhouse, soup kitchens, that sort of thing. But the kindest, most humane thing you could do, Ellis would say, is to arrange that no one's ever born into poverty. And since the notion is that poverty is a reflection of detrimental personality characteristics or a lack of intelligence or drive or what have you, promiscuity, all those sorts of things, well, the fewer people with those characteristics, then the less likely we will have poverty. We'll get rid of beggars at the front end, right? Instead of having to take care of them at the back end. So it's couched, right, in a very humanistic, very sympathetic, wanting to make a better society, make a world that's less painful, less ugly, less hurtful, fewer challenges and struggles for everyone. At least that's the vision they're offering. So these next few pictures, these come from again early 1900s. I believe some of these pictures are from that Kansas State Fair. There's some others that we'll go through here, but what you see here is a display at the fair for people to walk through and be educated about. And there's some flashing lights here to catch their attention. You can see the top light flashes every 15 seconds. It says every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. Right? So just letting you know that, hey, this stuff, this costing you money, right? $100 is that's a lot. There's a lot of money being spent on the prisons and the poorhouses and mental hospitals, and it's coming out of your pocket, taxpayer. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest, and it's not their fault. That's their heredity, right? Some of the other lights, this light flashes every 16 seconds, because every 16 seconds a person is born in the United States. That's to kind of, you get this visual representation. Every 60 minutes, someone's being born. Every 15 seconds, if your money's going out of your pocket, and there's an advertisement in the middle for a Fit or Family contest, and we got Uncle Sam there, right? It's a very patriotic thing we're doing at the Eastern States Exposition, right? And then over here on the right, this light flashes every 7.5 minutes, because every 7.5 minutes, a high grade person is born in the United States who will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come in that class, right? So again, visually trying to get you to see, oh my gosh, we're only getting a high grade person every 7.5 minutes, but every 15 seconds, money's coming out, $100 coming out of my pocket to take care of the poor and the imbeciles and the feeble-minded and the defectives, so on and so forth. So it's a very powerful kind of graphic image people would be presented with. Some more instruction, right? A question is being asked here on the right. How long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our pigs and chickens and cattle, and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or to blind sentiment, right? To the irrational forces of nature. We ought to take more care, right? We breed our pigs and our chickens and our cattle for the best meat and egg laying and all of that sort of thing we can. We work hard to do that. Why should we leave human beings to random chance? Over on the left side there, you'll have a description of marriages and what they lead to, right? So if you've ever in your stats courses done chi-square analyses, that's kind of what this is. If you've taken a biology class and maybe talked about dominant and recessive genes or the presence of genes, laid those out, you've seen this kind of this arrangement, that we see here, right? So if you have a pure marrying a pure, right, a high grade person, right? Well, their children will be normal. Notice the change in language. We went from pure and pure, not pure children, normal children, right? But then if you get an abnormal and an abnormal who marry, right, and they should say impure and impure, but we move to this language of normality and abnormality, right? Abnormal and abnormal married, well, their children are going to be abnormal. And if you get a pure and an abnormal to marry, their children, the children are normal but tainted, right? Meaning some of the grandchildren will be abnormal. These things will carry. If you get a tainted and an abnormal, then about half the children will be normal but tainted, and the other half will be straight up abnormal. Tainted and a pure, well, you get children who are half pure normal and half normal but tainted. And then if you get two tainted, right, then children of the children of every 4 children, you'll have an abnormal, a pure normal, and 2 tainted, right? It's all very scientific. It's laid out in this very easy to grasp way of what the probabilities are and the problems. Well, this picture represents some men who have been found guilty of different crimes, public drunkenness, and some other things like that, who, as part of their sentencing, have been required to hold signs in front of people on a street corner. And you can see some of the signs, right? I am a burden to myself and the state. Should I be allowed to propagate? I'm a burden. Why should I be allowed to have children? I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the craving to others? Would the prisons and asylums be filled if my kind had no children? And then finally, I cannot read this sign. By what right have I children? This is an article from Popular Science Monthly, a very famous magazine of the day, about registering human pedigrees. The genealogical work is very important to the eugenics movement to determine your origins and your fitness. And this article talks about how Kansas develops fitter families, the experiment in eugenics. And it was written by a U.S. senator from Kansas, Arthur Capper. And it mentions 2 women who were involved in this project, right? And the picture in the middle, of course, the one we saw a little earlier. Henry H. Goddard, he's a famous scientist at the time. He writes a book called The Kallikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. Right? And this book becomes a national bestseller. He proposed to do the genealogy of an entire family, and not just birth dates and death dates and marriage dates and number of children genealogy, but also biographies, right? This is what this person did, what that person did, what kind of life they led, the problems they had, and doing it to kind of point out that when you get the tainted and the abnormals marrying, they produce offspring that have terrible lives and cost the society a great deal. So here's the normal line and the degenerate line, and things get mapped out, and we see all sorts of things. This was, again, very important for the eugenicists to make their case about how important it was for us to take rational control, use our science to ensure the best possible outcomes for human beings. Even the very survival of our way of life, our democracy, what have you. This next slide, this is an advertisement page taken from a magazine, just books that were being advertised at the time. Picture of Henry Fairfield Osborn, another very important eugenicist of the day. He wrote a couple of these books here, The Origin and Evolution of Life, then Men of the Old Stone Age, Their Environment, Life, and Art. Then we get to, on the other side of the page, to have The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. And then Mankind at the bottom by Seth Humphrey, Racial Values and the Racial Prospect. Right? Now, these books were published by Charles Scribner's Sons, a publishing house on Fifth Avenue in New York, one of the largest in the country. It's still a very large publishing house. Just a few years ago, in fact, they actually made a public announcement apologizing for how they had been the main publishing arm and outlet for eugenicist research and books and so on and so forth. But they were not insignificant. I share this just so you can get a sense that this was a widespread phenomenon, right? And had the approval, the authority of scientists and important thinkers and shakers in the society. And we'll see a little bit of that here. This is the directors of the American Eugenics Society. And I want you to look at who's involved so you can realize this wasn't some fringe group. The president of the American Eugenics Society was Ellsworth Huntington. He was the president of Yale University. And you'll find other important members of New York University, Yale University, Columbia University. And then we work our way down into the advisory council. So those are the directors, and then we work our way down to the advisory council. And if you go down the list, take a few moments for you'll start to find a number of important psychologists who were part of this project early on. At the very bottom of the right-hand column, Robert Yerkes, who was an important motivational psychologist, gave us the Yerkes-Dodson law that's still important. You'll find a number of other folks like that, William McDougall, for example. And we'll talk about some of them. We'll take a look at these. You'll see also in there Professor E.L. Thorndike, right? One of the founders of behaviorism, right? Whose work we still study, right? And a number of others that we'll look at. But these are not insignificant people. These are important thought leaders and they're operating in significant, prestigious institutions and thoroughly committed to the eugenics vision. Right? So here, E.L. Thorndike, this founding figure of behaviorism, he's the originator of the law of effect upon which operant conditioning is kind of rooted. He fervently endorsed eugenics. He said, selective breeding can alter man's capacity to learn, to keep sane, to cherish justice, or to be happy. There's no more certain and economical way to improve man's environment as to improve his nature. Here we have G. Stanley Hall, again, one of the most important early psychologists, establishing psychology as an academic discipline. He had this to write. In fine, sex and reproduction have played a more and more important role in each of the following fields. Then he listed natural history, anthropology, sociology, psychology, biological ethics, religion. He says, in all these fields, sex is a common ground of larger and larger dimensions. It gives them more interest in each other and may be destined to bring them into a new and higher unity. We're going to bring all of these disparate sciences together, right? Meanwhile, eugenics draws upon all these domains and has pointed out many and will, let us hope, different ways of improving the human stock and helping the world on towards the kingdom of some kind of Superman. I'll let that one just sit there. I know G. Stanley Hall probably right now regrets ever having used that language or said that in light of how that got taken up by the Nazis. But nonetheless, there is a vision here of we're going to make perfect humans, or at least significantly better human beings, by using our science to craft the best kind of person. Anyway, so helping the world on towards the kingdom of some kind of Superman, to which the men of today may someday prove to be only a transition, right? A link. We will be their Neanderthals, right? A link which with all that absorbs us now may be lost sight of and possibly become a missing link. He wrote this in 1911 in Religious Education, Eugenics, Its Ideals and What It's Going to Do. Louis Terman, the man responsible for the Stanford Binet intelligence test, was an enthusiastic advocate for intelligence testing as a tool of eugenics. In his book, The Measurement of Intelligence in 1916, he stated that, quote, considering the tremendous cost of vice and crime, it is evident that psychological testing has found here one of its richest applications. Dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family, and found with extraordinary frequencies among Indians, Mexicans, and Negroes. High grade or borderline deficiency is very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families of the Southwest, and also among Negroes. Their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stocks from which they come. Children of this group should be segregated into separate classes. They cannot master abstractions, but they can often be made into efficient workers. From a eugenic point of view, they constitute a grave problem because of their unusually prolific breeding. This is from, like I say, his book, 1916, The Measurement of Intelligence. This was an academic work. This was a text, all right? Not just a pamphlet with the rantings of someone, a madman that no one would listen to. Terman was incredibly important. His entire work on intelligence testing was in the service of furthering the eugenics project. So what we have here, come up next, right? Just some eugenics journals, some academic journals, right? The Journal of Heredity, Eugenics, the Journal of Race Betterment, the Eugenics Review. You can see the dates on those things, 1911, 1909, 1914. The Eugenics Review continues. We can see 1965. It's still being published, 1965. This is 20 years after World War II, and there's still an academic journal devoted to this. Now, the next picture over here of this stack of journals, this is the Eugenics Quarterly, which changed its name in 1969 to Social Biology. The word eugenics had just gotten too much bad press, and so we changed the name of the journal to Social Biology, but continued to publish pretty much the same stuff. Excuse me. And it's still, I understand, still in publication today. But now we find journals like this, the Journal of Genetic Counseling and the Journal of Cognitive Enhancement, right? It's the eugenics of intelligence there. These are contemporary journals right now. Courses in eugenics increase in colleges in this country, right? This is a very old newspaper article headline, but it's talking about how eugenics is becoming a kind of standard part of the university curriculum based on the efforts of the American Eugenics Society. What you have here is this is courses in eugenics from the University of Pittsburgh College course catalog, course descriptions in the early 1900s, right? So there's biology 28 is eugenics, and then biology 33, again, a slightly abbreviated, abridged course on eugenics. Biology 34 was laboratory in eugenics, right? Well, anyway, so with that, then we'll talk a little bit about immigration. I mentioned it earlier, but let's revisit it, just give you a sense of the role that played. Between 1900 and 1920, so 100 years ago, right? Roughly 100, 120 years ago, that period of time, between 600,000 and 1.25 million immigrants per year were entering the United States. The largest percentage, large numbers were from Southern and Eastern European countries. But in 1924, the Immigration Restriction Act was passed, and that limited immigration to 165,000 per year to stop this sort of immigration. And quotas were set, right? So South and Eastern European groups were limited to 9% of that, right? So about 15,000 per year. And you had to go through a lot. You had to pay a lot, you had to demonstrate you had a valuable skill and education, were fluent in English, were self-supporting, had a job offer in the country, that sort of thing. A lot of hoops you had to go through it. And a lot of those things are still in place today. We still have them. Sterilization laws, right? The compulsory sterilization laws. The first one was passed in 1907 in Indiana. The last procedure was carried out in 1981 in Oregon. A lot of people are very surprised by that. Was most commonly targeted population for compulsory sterilization were the mentally retarded, the feeble-minded, and the mentally ill, right? Also targeted under many state laws were the deaf, blind, epileptics, those who were otherwise physically disabled, orphans, homeless people, and homosexuals. Some criminals were sterilized in prisons as well. Ultimately, between 1907 and 1981, over 65,000 individuals were sterilized in 33 states in the United States. I'll talk very briefly, just one example, one case. This is the case of Buck versus Bell. It was a Supreme Court case. Carrie Buck and her mother Emma there, a picture of them taken in 1924. Carrie's mother got in trouble with the law for a number of different reasons. So Carrie was taken from her and was given to relatives, was placed in foster care with some relatives who didn't want her. They did want the money for her, but they didn't really care much about her. Anyway, so at one point, she becomes pregnant. And it was because, now, most of this was kept secret at the time, but it turned out eventually, as the case got studied later, after it was taken to the Supreme Court, that she had actually been raped by one of the members of the foster family. But the family wanted to keep that hush-hush. They didn't want their reputation sullied. They didn't want, so they blamed her. They said Carrie was unmanageable, that she was unintelligent, incapable. She wasn't doing well in school. She was promiscuous. She was a headache. She was causing, and so then she was committed to a state mental institution where a number of individuals who were actively looking for an opportunity to get eugenics laws passed and justified, the ones that were on the books in states, various states, get those justified and further laws passed. They realized they needed to take something to the Supreme Court, and they saw the possibility with Carrie Buck. And so she was repeatedly tested and found to be incapable and in a variety of ways. And so her case was taken forward. That, of course, realized the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was just 3 years before this. And the Supreme Court then, in this context of Virginia's laws and other laws that were being passed, decided that Carrie Buck was the probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring, who would likewise be afflicted as she was, that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that her welfare and that of her society will be promoted by her sterilization. The Supreme Court decided that the state of Virginia had every right to sterilize her and anyone like her that they decided were undesirable. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the towering intellects of the American Supreme Court, wrote this famously in the Buck v. Bell decision. He wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. I think it is probable," he wrote, "that civilization somehow will last as long as I care to look ahead, perhaps with smaller numbers, but perhaps also bred to greatness and splendor by science." And most famously, he wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The interesting thing about Buck v. Bell is that it has never been overturned. It's still very much the law of the land, even though it has fallen out of favor in states we've moved away from that. But the precedence there has never been rescinded or challenged. If we were in class, and I brought this up on the screen, had the tech podium there, we could click on this link down here. If you go and download this slide show, this PowerPoint from Learning Suite, you can go here and you can click on that link, and what that will take you to is this very interesting website where you can look at different states and see when they passed their sterilization laws, how many individuals were sterilized, what the demographics of those groups were, males, females, white, black, Hispanic, what have you, right? All of that information there, when the laws were repealed, so on and so forth, and it's an eye opener. Go check out your home state. Go check out some of the other ones and see that there were some states with very little, and other states with quite a few cases. What you have on the screen here, this map of the United States, simply shows the states that had such laws and the order in which. So you see number 1 there is Indiana, and then we work through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. You can see Utah was 23rd, Idaho was 21, Nevada 5th, Arizona 28th, California 3rd, Washington 2nd, so on and so forth. Anyway, then you can see that there were a number of states that never did pass any such laws. But it's a fascinating website, so I encourage you to get the PowerPoint down from Learning Suite and maybe go check that out. Iowa was 6 there. Well, let's jump a little bit now that we've laid out kind of the history and talked a little bit about the role that the social sciences and psychology had in stimulating law, public policy, and a general kind of sociological, cultural climate. This is Richard Dawkins, a very famous evolutionary biologist at Oxford University, who is often saying and doing controversial things, but this is something that he had to say just recently. He said, in the 1920s and 1930s, scientists from both the political left and right would not have found the idea of designer babies particularly dangerous, though of course they would not have used that phrase. Today, I suspect that the idea is too dangerous for comfortable discussion, and my conjecture is that Adolf Hitler is responsible for that change. Nobody wants to be caught agreeing with that monster, even in a single particular. The specter of Hitler has led some scientists to stray from ought to is, and deny that breeding for human qualities is even possible. But if you can breed cattle for milk yield, horses for running speed, and dogs for herding skill, why on earth should it be impossible to breed humans for mathematical, musical, or athletic ability? I wonder whether, some 60 years after Hitler's death, we might at least venture to ask what the moral difference is between breeding for musical ability and forcing a child to take music lessons, or why it is acceptable to train fast runners and high jumpers, but not to breed them. It's one thing to deplore eugenics on ideological, political, moral grounds. It is quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? Facts ignore ideology. This was from a very famous and controversial tweet. Then a follow-up tweet, number 2. For those determined to miss the point, I deplore the idea of eugenic policy. I simply said deploring it doesn't mean it wouldn't work. Just as we breed cows to yield more milk, we could breed humans to run faster or jump higher, but heaven forbid that we should do it. I find Dawkins fascinating on this point, aggravating as well, because he's a self-proclaimed very thoroughgoing genetic determinist, a materialist committed to neo-Darwinian evolutionary naturalism. And yet some of the things he has to say here, probably, for example, it makes me stop and say, well, now, hold on just a second there, Professor Dawkins. As an atheist who's committed to reductive naturalism, and we've talked about reductive naturalism in class before, you don't believe in any heaven, any God, or any absolute moral order that could ever make it truly wrong to engage in eugenics. So how could heaven forbid us from doing what you think would absolutely work if we wanted to do it? You may be, Professor Dawkins, you may be personally disgusted by the idea. You may find it uncouth. You may suggest that we ought not do that. But at the end of the day, that's just an expression of your personal preference, right? Not any moral absolute, because there is no such thing as any moral absolutes. There's no divinely appointed or transcendent moral order of rights and wrongs. There's simply the struggle to survive and adapt. So you think you're going to have to work this out a little more carefully than you have. This was one of the earliest selfies I ever took, just so you know what that's about. Anyway, John Glad, professor at the University of Maryland, had this to say: I define humanity not as the totality of people alive today, but as the totality of people who will ever live. Thus, the greater good argument, utilitarian ethics, dictates that we assume our parental responsibilities. Our moral obligation to do everything in our power to ensure that children be born healthy and intelligent seems so obvious that it should not have to be argued. Eugenics is also flesh and blood of the environmental movement. It's human ecology. We cannot act as the ultimate invasive species, counting on moving to a different planet after we've trashed our own. Eugenics is joined at the hip, the heritage of Malthus. David Sloan Wilson, evolutionary biologist at Binghamton University. Completing the Darwinian revolution therefore requires a massive reset in our understanding of humanity. Which must take place at a time scale of years, not decades, to get after this quick. We need not just a theory that states what is, but a worldview that informs how we ought to act, while remaining fully within the bounds of scientific knowledge. Once we are equipped with a toolkit, we can get right to work addressing problems that everyone wants to solve, such as our physical and mental health, and optimal ways to raise our children. Along the way, we will see that there is no dividing line between biology, human, and culture. Zoltan Istvan is a journalist, a very famous science writer. In an attempt to solve overpopulation and give hundreds of millions of future kids a better life, I cautiously endorse the idea of licensing parents, a process that would be little different than getting a driver's license. Parents who pass a series of basic tests qualify and get the green light to get pregnant and raise children. Those applicants who are deemed unworthy, perhaps because they are homeless or have drug problems or are violent criminals or have no resources to raise a child properly and keep it from going hungry, would not be allowed until they could demonstrate they were suitable parents. Now, what we as psychologists would have to ask ourselves is, okay, so who's going to devise those tests? Who's going to administer them? Who's going to interpret them? Who's going to make the decisions about fitness and unfitness? Not the biologists, not the geneticists. The psychologists are going to be making these decisions. So that's why I say this has much to do with psychology. Julian Savulescu, a professor of philosophy and bioethics at Oxford University, as well as he was at the University of London, he had this to say: but eugenics just means having a child who's better in some way. Eugenics is alive and well today. When people screen their pregnancies for Down syndrome or intellectual disability, that's eugenics. What was wrong with Nazi eugenics was that it was involuntary. People had no choice. People today can choose to utilize the fruits of science to make these selection decisions. Today, eugenics is about giving couples the choice of a better or worse life for themselves. It sounds very humane, right? It's about freedom. It's about possibility, opportunity. No one's going to make you do this. No one's going to make you have certain children or prevent you from having children or marrying who you want or so on. But you have to, again, think about it a little bit, right? Even if you leave that open, even if you say this is about choice, not being forced, well, it wouldn't take long for two very different groups to develop: those who have made the right choice and those who haven't. Right? So it's rosy here, but that's how these always start out, right? No one in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Galton, Ellis, Terman, Thorndike, none of these folks envisioned the Holocaust. None of them envisioned Nazi racist eugenics science. They were just trying to make the world a better place and using science to do so. Sobolescu says further, in my view, we should choose genes if those characteristics affect a person's happiness. A rising percentage of kids today are on Ritalin for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But that's not because there's suddenly been some epidemic of ADHD. It's because you're crippled as a human being if you have poor impulse control and can't concentrate long enough, if you can't defer small rewards now for larger rewards in the future. Having self-control is extremely important to strategic planning, and Ritalin enhances that characteristic in children at the low end of impulse control. Now, if you were able to test for poor impulse control in embryos, I believe and that's a big if. But then he says, if we could do that, I believe we should select ones with a better chance of having more choices in life, whether you want to be a plumber, a taxi driver, a lawyer, or the president. The next stage of human evolution, he writes, may be rational evolution, where we select children not only to have the greatest chance of surviving, reproducing, and being free of disease, but who also have the greatest opportunities to have the best lives. Who gets to define best life, of course? Well, people like Professor Sobolescu. This is from an article he wrote entitled New Breeds of Humans, the Moral Obligation to Enhance. Right? We have a moral obligation to make the world a better place by instituting eugenics. Professor Peter Singer, who's a chair of ethics, bioethics at Princeton University, and used to serve on the President's Bioethics Council, President Obama's council. We have to take account of the probability that when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of happy life for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second. It's a very rational utilitarian ethic, right? Presumably we can quantify happiness, define it operationally, and what we're looking for is the greatest overall amount of happiness in the world. And if the first infant is going to bring down the amount of overall happiness in the world, and the second one is going to increase the overall amount of happiness in the world, well, the first one must be sacrificed to bring that about. Professor Singer is famous for having argued that parents ought to have a 2-year grace period after the birth of any child to decide whether they wanted to keep it or not, whether to end its life. Because on his view, infants don't really become persons. They're human, right? It's always human life. Even in utero, it's a human life, but it's not a person. So the notion is we're not dealing with a person until around 2 years of age, when the infant begins to engage in conversation, have some sense of self-awareness. Before that, they're really just a kind of a drain. And his argument is, in that course, if we're dealing with a disabled infant or otherwise, then there's nothing wrong in killing that child, that infant. Human babies are not born self-aware, he writes, or capable of grasping their lives over time. They're not persons. Hence, their lives would seem to be no more worthy of protection than the life of a fetus. Of course, infanticide needs to be strictly legally controlled and rare, but it should not be ruled out any more than abortion. The life of a newborn is actually of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. You might ask Professor Singer, why is the life of a newborn human of less value? Well, because it takes fewer resources to take care of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Pigs can provide food, right? Dogs, companionship, and chimpanzees are important for helping us understand our own evolutionary origins. Human infants, sometimes, particularly when disabled or unwanted, or possessing certain psychological traits that are unwanted, are simply a drain on our resources, limited resources. We only have so much to go around, so we have to be judicious. Well, this is just to give you a sense of some of the literature that's coming out in the past few years. See, these are books, right, that book covers within the past decade, some of them within just the past year or two. Enhancing Evolution by John Harris, The Ethical Case for Making Better People. More Than Human by Ramez Nam. Completing the Darwinian Revolution, Radical Evolution, Humanity Enhanced. Some more you can see here. Human Enhancement over there, and then Enhancing Human Capacities, those big white covered books. Those are very, very large, very thick, edited volumes by very prestigious university presses and publishers, Wiley Blackwell, Oxford University Press, I believe, there, that have a vast array of book chapters and articles written by a large number of scholars in a lot of different disciplines exploring the idea of enhancement. So we don't want to use the word eugenics anymore because that has such negative connotations. So we now use the word enhancement, cognitive enhancement, biological enhancement, and even moral enhancement. As you see, the one book title, Unfit for the Future here, the need for moral enhancement, where Pearson and Savulescu are making the case that there's a moral imperative for modifying the human species in terms of not just physical and intellectual capabilities, but moral sensitivities, that we need people with the right moral worldview going forward, because people with the wrong moral worldview are endangering the planet in various ways. Anyway, just a sense of what's coming off the press, as well as what's showing up in journals and so on and so forth. Here we have a chapter from Enhancing Human Capacities, that book I just pointed out, this one by Powell and Buchanan. And here's the promise. We're breaking evolution's chains, right? The promise of enhancement by design. They start by saying, only quite recently in the history of life has nature produced a species whose understanding of evolution makes possible the intentional modification of its own genome, right? Eugenics, the self-direction of human evolution, right? And they go on with this. There's something very important here. Evolutionary theory is becoming self-reflective, they say. Understanding how evolution works is enabling us to modify the course of our own evolution if we choose to do so. There's just some irony for you to think about in there. On the one hand, there's the presumption that natural selection as a law governing material events is thoroughly mechanically deterministic, and yet somehow it has given rise to a species that has freedom, that we've broken the chains, the deterministic chains of evolutionary naturalism, and now we can go back and take control of the whole process. How that exactly happened and how that could ever possibly happen, how you could get something like human agency out of meat and chemical and their mechanical interactions is never really answered, it's simply asserted. But anyway, you get a sense. This is from the book was published in, just 10 years ago, 2011, and one of the first major, as I said, collections of scholarly work examining the possibilities of enhancing our capacities, whether through the use of genetic modifications, biological additions, or, as you can tell from the cover of the book, from medical pharmacological interventions, right? Here's the case for moral bioenhancement that Pearson and Savulescu make. They say, we shall contend that in order for the majority of citizens of liberal democracies to be willing to go along with constraints on their extravagant consumption, their moral motivation must be enhanced so that they pay more heed to the interests of future generations and non-human animals. Our knowledge of human biology, in particular genetics and neurobiology, is now beginning to supply us with means of directly affecting the biological or physiological bases of human motivation. For example, by the use of pharmacological and genetic methods, like genetic selection and engineering. We shall suggest that there are in principle no philosophical or moral objections to the use of such biomedical means of moral enhancement. But kind of an interesting, there's no moral objection to moral enhancement. Because if you had a moral objection to moral bioenhancement, then clearly you are in need of moral bioenhancement, right? It's kind of playing fast and loose here, maybe with a loaded deck, right? But the current predicament of humankind is so serious, with all sorts of overpopulation, global warming, all sorts of things. It's imperative that scientific research explore every possibility of developing effective means of moral bioenhancement. I won't, just in consideration of time, I won't spend a lot of time talking about Chinese eugenics and the one-person policy, one-child policy. It was rescinded, but its effects are still in place. But it was an official eugenics movement. The Chinese persecution of the religious minority, the Uyghurs, that's going on today, is part of a vast kind of eugenics project in China. Again, based on time and how long this is already going, I won't talk about gender-based abortion as a way to, as a means of eugenics, pursuing eugenics agenda. But you can click, you can get this, download the PowerPoint, and take a look at some of those links. And just get some more information. You could look at one of these links goes to information about present-day Sweden. We could have a link on there to Iceland, in which official governmental policy is in place to essentially raise the level or decrease the level of Down syndrome births to zero. They want any infants, any unborn children identified as possessed of trisomy 21 Down syndrome to be aborted, so that there aren't any in their society. And you can look at some more of that as you go through here. It's a eugenics approach, right? Some more by Professor Sabalescu on this. If couples or single reproducers have decided to have a child and selection is possible, then they have a significant moral reason to select a child of the possible children they could have, whose life can be expected in light of the relevant available information to go best, or at least not worse than any of the others. The principle tells prospective parents to aim to have the child who, given her genetic endowment, can be expected to enjoy most well-being in her life. Now, see, there's well-being, right? That's a concept that keeps happiness and well-being and moral sensibility, moral views, or cognitive capabilities. These are all psychological phenomena, right? How does that happen? How could any of this happen, right? Well, maybe end here with something by Arthur Caplan, who wrote this back in 2016. Renegade scientists and totalitarian loonies are not the folks most likely to abuse genetic engineering. You and I are. Not because we're bad, but because we want to do good. In a world dominated by competition, parents understandably want to give their kids every advantage. The most likely way for eugenics to enter into our lives is through the front door, as nervous parents will fall over one another to be the first to give Junior a better set of genes. So I'll just wrap this up. I'm hoping that you come through this, not only having more information, more awareness of these issues, their background, their history, and so on and so forth, but that you have an increased sense of the importance of appreciating what I said at the beginning of this video, the beginning of the course, and I've repeated, ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences, and we get ourselves into all sorts of problems. Some small manageable problems, some major cultural moral catastrophes, right? Sometimes that's what we get because we don't think through the implications. We don't understand the assumptions we're working with. We don't understand where it's taking us. We don't think it through. We don't consider the possibilities, and we don't learn from history. We don't study the history of ideas just to mark off a checkbox and say, oh, okay, so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that, and this happened and that happened. Okay, now I've got this list of information. We study intellectual history so that we have a better grasp on what's going on in our own day. How did we get where we're at right now? Where are we headed? Do we want to head down that road, or do we need to take a stand and reevaluate and consider other options, right? That it really is true that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And most of the folks that we've been reading about, talking about, looking at their work in the course of this video have good intentions. I think most of them are probably very decent people just trying to do the best they can, but they don't appreciate their hidden assumptions about naturalism, reductive naturalism, determinism, mechanism. They don't understand their assumptions about the nature of science. And so that blinds them to certain incoherent things that they say that don't make sense, that they say at the same time. We looked at a couple of those, but also they don't appreciate where this is going to lead if we don't pay attention. And so learning to pay attention to ideas means learning where they came from, how they're showing up here and now, and understanding where they're likely to lead us. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you were able to, if you wanted to watch it all the way through, if you wanted to watch it in bits and pieces, that's fine too. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll download the PowerPoint and maybe review this. And I know that Seth and Taylor will be available to do reviews, to kind of go back over this, since I know you probably have some questions. And certainly, of course, you can email me, get a hold of me with questions, comments, anything as well. I'm happy to answer that, and I can't wait to be back in the classroom with you all.